All right, so in today's video, I wanted to share some advice that I just recently gave to a young entrepreneur who's been having some trouble with inconsistency in his company's revenue. So he's actually somebody that used to work for me, left off on a good foot, decided to go out on his own and apply what he learned. It wasn't easy. He was somebody that was important to my business, but I like to keep relationships good. And I wanted to support him. You never know how things will work out in the future, and that's especially the case with business relationships. And so we've kept in touch. I've continued to help him and answer questions as he's worked on growing his own business. And he reached out to me and he said, when you're a business owner and you're an entrepreneur, you have employees, they don't always understand why you make decisions that you make. And it's so funny when you've trained people, you've had them as an employee in your company, and then they go out on their own. And it's very satisfying to get the text message where it's like, hey, remember when I would give you pushback on this? Or, we had that disagreement because I didn't understand why you made a decision. And now I understand. That's a very satisfying text to get. So it was one of those things where as he was an employee, I was at one point probably over explaining to this individual, and I kind of saw that he may eventually go out on his own. I was like, hey, the thing you've got to understand is that businesses have fluctuations in cash flow. And those fluctuations in cash flow can be related to a lot of things, but they're often related to decisions that we make, right? So I might make a decision now that impacts us 2 or 3 months down the line negatively. Or you may work on a project and something goes wrong, and that project, we end up losing a client or something, and that, loses us money. But it's not what happened today. It's, what we did in the past. And so he reached out to me, he said, hey, you remember those conversations that we had about businesses having fluctuations in cash flow and having highs and lows? He says, I understand that now. I understand how, when we were working together, how and why you made it so that bonuses and raises and all those things were so connected to the growth of the business. He's like, I totally get it. And I totally get how just because the business was making a lot of money, there's other expenses and all these other things. And so he reached out to me. He said, here's the problem I'm having. He said, I've got really good months and I've got really bad months. And he said, looking at the end of the year, looking at the previous year, he said, here's the situation. He says, we have all of our bills paid personally. We're making ends meet. He's like, we're not getting rich, but we're making ends meet. I've been happy with my decision and what I'm doing. He's like, but the problem is, he's like, we have these big swings month to month, right? And it just depends on if I land a client, if I don't land a client, what ends up happening with that. What I was thinking of doing is I was thinking of doing two things. One, I was thinking of putting all of our personal expenses on a credit card, because what I've seen, we always are able to pay our bills, but sometimes if we have a bad month, it's a little bit harder and we get a little bit behind. And then when we have a good month, we have to catch up. So he says, I was thinking about, I wanted to get your advice on what if I put all of my personal expenses on a credit card, and then that kind of took the pressure off, and then I paid it at the end of each month. He said, and ultimately, he said, because we're covering all of our bills, we've been doing this for about a year now, I know what we're making, I've got some idea of consistency. He's like, I want to know if I should also do that with my business account. Now, anybody who works with me knows that I'm not, Dave Ramsey. I think Dave Ramsey's amazing. I think he's got great advice. I don't agree with him about the use of credit cards, because he's basically like, hey, people don't, like, credit cards are a problem. You should never have a credit card. You shouldn't go into debt, all of that. The reason I disagree with that advice personally for entrepreneurs and business owners is that, one, the foundation of our economy, of the US economy, is a debt-based society, right? What that means is that the money in the economy, 97% of all the money in the US economy, is the result of debt. In other words, money is generated or created from debt or through debt. So most money exists in the form of created debt or as the result of debt. It exists in the future and is created by productivity. Won't get into that too much right now. So first reason is we live in a debt-based economy. I don't think it's a good idea to tell people to avoid understanding debt and the use of debt when one of the fundamental principles of the economy is debt. And that's how the money is created in that economy. Two, I think that when you are an entrepreneur and you run a business, I think that you need access to capital quickly. And I think that if you use it properly, that debt can be good. Definitely an area where Dave Ramsey and I would disagree. He's done incredible things without debt, just absolutely incredible. And I think it comes down to personal opinion on this. However, the problem with debt, and I think this is why Dave advocates so strongly against it, and I think for most people it is probably a good idea. To me, the root cause of the problem with debt and credit cards and things like that is not the credit card itself. Most people have not been trained or taught or have not developed the self-control that they need to manage money until you've developed some of that financial self-control and an understanding of money and how it works. That to me is the root cause of why debt is considered bad. We live in a society that promotes instant gratification, getting it now, not having to wait. And that is ultimately the problem. And so what I think is better is if you can develop self-control and an understanding of financial systems and create financial systems for yourself personally and for your business. Those financial systems should be rooted in the basics of finance. I'm a firm believer that you cannot master something until you've mastered the absolute basics, the things in their most simple form. And so when this former employee of mine reached out and said, "Hey, we're having these issues. I know that we can make them meet, but, I just wanted to see what your opinion was of basically getting some credit cards, putting the personal expenses on the one credit card, putting the other expenses on the business credit card, and then paying those off at the end of each month." And instead of answering his question, and I'd given him what I just shared with you about the debt-based economy and creating personal financial systems, I'd given him that advice before. I just simply asked him a question. I said, "Let me ask you this." I said, "Are you in your personal account? Are you saving at least 10% every month of all money that comes in? Do you put 10 cents of that away, like religiously, into a retirement account, a savings account? Are you setting that aside and leaving it there and not tapping into it?" And one area I really agree with Dave Ramsey on is having the initial emergency fund and then the 6-month emergency fund. Could not agree with that more. Such good advice. I said, "So are you doing that in your personal?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Okay, are you building up your business reserves, right? Are you setting aside some reserve capital in your business that, you can use to kind of help you float this and access this money?" And again, he said no. And I said, "Here's the problem. You're trying to use a complex financial system that has a lot of moving parts, that it has some risk, and it has some things that could go wrong. You're trying to do that first before you've applied the most basics of setting aside 10 to 15% of all the money you make personally for your personal savings and retirement, building up cash reserves for your business to protect it." I said, because you haven't done the basics of financial management in your business, right? The next thing is probably like, well, that's the whole issue, is I can't afford to do that right now. I said, well, when you have the good months, you certainly can. So put aside double the amount then, right? Or make sure that you have the habit, because what'll happen is you'll be able to use that to stabilize both your business and your personal. And I said, so because you have not mastered the basics for your personal finances and for your business finance, then I wouldn't recommend doing it. I wouldn't recommend trying to use an advanced strategy that has more risk, that has more moving parts, with the current basic financial systems being lacking. But here's the thing. As a habit for years, I think it's really, really good for people to every 3 months at a minimum look at their spending habits, right? Personal and business, and cut expenses. Cut anything unnecessary. Because if you're not doing that, again, that to me is a basic financial system, right? It's a lot easier to keep more of what you already have and to cut some expenses. And little cuts can start to add up both on the personal and in the business. I almost guarantee anybody that if they look at their personal spending, they can find 5 to 10% of things to cut. Almost guaranteed. If you go 3 months, your Apple subscriptions, your Netflix, your Hulu, your subscriptions start to add up over time, not to mention like, oh, we went out to eat because we didn't feel like making dinner. And that's a sacrifice, right? That you have to make. You have to be willing to make. Same with the business, right? You can almost always sit down after a 3-month period of time and cut out hundreds or even thousands of dollars from your budget in a very short period of time. So I said, if you're like, I don't have the money to do it, step one is look at your personal spending over the past 3 to 6 months, look at your business spending over the past 3 to 6 months, cut what you can, cut as much as you can, right? And then look at what you've cut, and that's what you set aside. Or more, right? And when you have those good months, set aside extra, right? First, master the cutting of expenses and the setting aside of capital in the business and finance for the personal. I said, then if you still want to do that, personally, I have no problem with it. I just wouldn't do it because it's an advanced strategy, right? And it's an advanced financial strategy that you're trying to apply when you don't have the basics down. So I thought that was an interesting conversation, how that kind of came full circle. Young entrepreneurs who've only been in business for a few years, it's something that may help them to build more profitable businesses and not be so, not to live in feast or famine cycles, and to not try to do advanced financial strategies when you don't have basic financial strategies down. So hopefully this is helpful. If you enjoyed this video, I'd love to have you subscribe to the channel and see more. I'd love to share more insights and, just from my personal experience with you. So go ahead and subscribe and, check out some of the other videos. And I'd love to see you. If you like this video, click that subscribe button, and I look forward to seeing you in future videos.